Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and I am here for my LCK week number 5 overview and analysis video here in the summer split. By the end of this week, we're going to be over halfway done with the LCK regular season. The first round robin will technically have completed. We have a pretty good idea of where a lot of these teams sit, but there still is some movement at the top of the standings that maybe we weren't getting last split. This is definitely a bit more dynamic and, not to spoil too much, but there are definitely some upsets to go over in today's video. If you want to know my thoughts on everything that's happened in the LCK up until this point, check out the playlist up in the iCard right now. That's every single week of the LCK overviewed and analyzed in the same way that this video will be. Weeks 1 through 4, of course, but today we're going to be going over week number 5, so I'm excited to get into it. I hope you guys are as well. Without further ado, let's jump into it. If you are new here, what we are going to do is go series by series, talking about the advantages and the disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the series and a dud of the series for each individual series that we cover, and at the end of the week, I will be giving a player of the week and a dud of the week to kind of tie everything into a nice, neat little bow. Of course, I will also be updating my personal power rankings from number 1 to number 10, talking about where I think these teams are moving. Do I think teams are getting better? Do I think teams are getting worse? Do I think generally the league is in a strong state right now? It's certainly an interesting conversation to have, especially after the games that we got this week, but it's one that I'm interested to talk about, so we will go over all of that at the end of the video. But going series by series means we get to start off with day number 1. That's kind of how it ends up going, and kicking off day number 1, a pretty predictable outcome, one of our more predictable outcomes of the week. Okay, BRION taking on Dplus KIA, and DK is going to pick up the 2-0 series win. Bro has still yet to win a series this split. They go to 0-9. They drop to 4-18 in terms of their game score. This is just by far the worst team in the LCK, at least in terms of performance, and there's really not a lot of positives to take away from their current roster construction, from the way that they currently play the game. Even players that have previously looked good in isolation, I think I've just completely folded and looked really bad in terms of how they have played for this team in particular. This split, it feels like they're just getting the worst out of all of their players, which is pretty traditional of this organization that has basically failed at every fundamental level to put on the Rift a team that can function, right? This is not a good org, this is not a good team, and they continue to prove that. For DK, they are rising above all of my expectations. I thought this was just going to be another good team. Yes, they finished in the top 4 the previous split, and I think there was reason to believe that they could be a Worlds team, like, not guaranteed, but pretty close to being guaranteed, at least a favorite for that 4th spot to go to Worlds, but they have been even better than that. They have been able to take down a ton of teams that maybe we didn't expect them to be able to beat, and their consistency has really risen above a lot of the other teams around them in the standings, like Hanwha Life, and hell, even like T1 at times, and they went and proved that again here in this series with a 2-0 win. And again, not the most defining in the universe, just because, bro's not the best, but winning is winning, and you gotta count something towards that. Player of the series for me is gonna go to Showmaker. In the mid lane, he continues to be the driving force for what this team wants to do, but I think really the emergence of Lucid in the jungle over the course of this split is what's kind of changed their trajectory. Showmaker has been good, basically his whole career. That's not gonna be a surprise. I mean, he's been great in his, prime, 2020, 2021. We knew he was one of the best mid laners, one of the best players in the world, a top 5 player in the world, but I think people were a little bit more concerned about him the last couple of years. I was not one of those people. I've always been relatively in on Showmaker. I've always thought that he was a bit underrated, at least like last year, and during these years where DK wasn't performing as well, I think Showmaker was the best player on this team, and, he was showing that a lot at the beginning of the year. The problem was they just didn't have the same kind of consistency surrounding him. I think bot lane had some ups and some downs. I think jungle was, in my opinion, the biggest problem for this team in the spring split. Lucid, quite frankly, was just not very good. He was a bottom, 3 or 4 jungler in the league. He just wasn't performing all that well in spring until the playoffs hit, and that's when things really started to click into place for him. He was really good against KT Rolster, really good against Gen.G, which I guess was a bit more expected because he was, of course, going up against his former teammate in Canyon, who he has always played really well into, at least in the small amount of times that we've seen those two play against each other. DK actually does a really good job playing into Gen.G, but he's really expanded his game to get a lot more consistent over the course of this split, and that is why I'm so high on this team. If Lucid can maintain this upward trajectory, start to reach some of that potential that we were talking about for him, then it's going to be a really, really scary position and situation to try to stop if you're an opposing team, because Lucid can really really take over the early game. That's something that he is really adept at, and Showmaker can kind of just win games for you in the mid game because of his great macro and his great execution, and that's become a very dangerous duo. That was very much the case here. People are memeing because Showmaker ended up playing Ziggs after the whole APA, meeting, and it's very funny how that ended up working out, but Showmaker looked awesome on the Ziggs in Game 2, was arguably even better on the LeBlanc in Game number 1. Just a really great series overall from Showmaker. Continues to be one of the best players in the LCK, regardless of whether or not he is getting that recognition. I already talked about Lucid, very good on the Sedge and the Maokai. With the AP junglers rising up, I think people are starting to undervalue these facilitators. They're still very good. Aiming and Kellen continue to look awesome as a duo. Aiming is just hyper consistent. You kind of know what you're going to get out of him. I shouldn't say hyper consistent because there are going to be some bad games every once in a while, but he's consistent in the fact that you know what you're going to get in terms of aiming. And then Kellen is a player that everybody underrates and has always been way better than the reputation that he has gotten. He just actually has the ability to kind of move around the map and do that right now. In a lot of other circumstances, he was more reliant on players like Canyon to take the lead because that was just the team dynamic. I think actually being freed of Canyon is helpful for Kellen overall. It allows him to be more of a primary facilitator for this team. And then Kingion's pretty good on the top side, was definitely the better top laner. He's really filled this role well. DK is a scary team. They're just pretty complete across the board. They might not have the best top end talent, although Showmaker is pretty darn close, but they're really complete across the board, and that's what makes them a little bit scarier than some of the other teams around them in the standings right now. But for Bro, this team has a myriad of problems. I've criticized this team and this org multiple times over the past 2 years, even 3 years going back on this channel, and I'm not going to stop here. I do like some of the moves they've made in the midseason or in the offseason. Obviously, Morgan, I think, is a relatively decent player, even if he's having what I would consider his worst split of all time right now. Youngjae is a player that I really like that they loaned in because he is kind of an interesting young player. It gives you at least something to be, excited about in terms of the future if you are able to bring him into the organization full time, but everything else on this team is just a bit of a disaster. Dead of the series is going to go to Polbay. They've not been able to find any sort of answer in the mid lane. It's just kind of been really bad for them, whether it's Polbay or Karis. Both are just kind of bad. Karis has, quite frankly, just been better in terms of the performances, and that's not a good sign because Karis is not good. Envy and Polu continue to be by far the worst bot lane in the LCK. Polu has just been awful this split. Like, his engages are way too aggressive. He's not on the same page as the rest of the team. I understand the idea of trying to find flank angles, but he does it at times that I just do not think are beneficial, and it goes back to what I've been saying a lot over the course of this split, which is that support right now is the hardest it's been to play at a high level in many, many years, just because of the way that carries are kind of structured. There are a lot of more options. There are a lot more safe options, and generally speaking, there's a lot more damage in the game right now, which means you have to time your engages even more carefully, especially in the back half of these games, and Polu is just not the kind of player who's been able to do that. Envy is just a complete nothing in the AD carry role, whether it's him or Samver, it doesn't even really matter. Bro is just not a good team in terms of their current construction. They've made everybody on their roster look worse over the course of this year, which is never ideal. So they dropped to 0-9, DK moves to 7-2. Doesn't get easier for DK. This is going to be their easiest series of the week and their easiest series for a while, but at the very least, they were able to get a win out of it. And then moving on to our second series of day number 1, and a much more interesting clash between two projected playoff teams, the Kwangdong Freecs, taking on Hanwha Life Esports, and HLE is going to pick up the 2-0 series win. This is also not really an upset for as good and as strong as KDF has been at the beginning of this split, and as much progress as I think they've made as a roster. The top 4 feels like the top 4, at least at the current moment in terms of consistency, and HLE is very much a part of that. They handle business here, and they continue to look really good. Honestly, HLE is a contender to get top 2 in this region. They very much have the skill set to be able to do that. We've talked about DK and T1 being in that conversation, but HLE, over the course of this entire year, you could argue they've been the most consistent of those 3 teams in terms of the performances that they have given. And so, it's really good to see them continue to do that. Player of the series is going to go to Viper. He was player of the week for the entire LCK last week, and, I've been praising Viper and what he's been able to do on a game-by-game basis for quite a while now. I sometimes don't think his highs are quite as high as someone like Elk or Jackie Love or like the other, best AD carries in the world. But his floor is so much higher than theirs that it almost doesn't matter. And then you still get like ridiculous carry games like game 2 here on the Ezreal, where he is just able to completely take over and still have that game-breaking type of mentality. It just reminds you that Viper, is probably the best AD carry in the world, on a consistency basis. And so, Viper's awesome. I'm not going to say anything negative about him. He was great in this series. Peanut's obviously been the player that I pointed out the most, I would say, on HLE at the beginning of this year, and that's mostly just because I think he's been going very underrated undervalued by most of the community. I think he is an MVP frontrunner right now, but, you know, Viper was definitely a little bit more relevant, I would say, in this series. Zeka was also very good. Of course, the Yone looks excellent. He's great at these melee carries, but I still think that he continues to just randomly get hate for games that really aren't that bad. It's so funny. If Showmaker played the exact same Lucian game that Zeka did in game 2, no one would be talking about it. But the fact that it's Zeka, it's like, oh, well, you know, he was good in lane, but he was horrible in team fights, you know, yada, 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 just overblowing the negativity of his gameplay. He is just fine. He is about it. I would give him around the same grade as Showmaker individually as a player. He's a borderline top 10 player in the world, somewhere in that caliber. He has been very consistent, I would say, over the course of this year, and the negatives I just do not think fit the actual gameplay when you watch. And Doran is the other player that I really want to give a big shout out to. Top lane was very much in favor of HLE, but a lot of that came through in team fights, and that's really where you want to see Doran make his biggest impact. I actually think he's been a phenomenal team fighter this split. It was a little bit concerning because he wasn't quite as good in spring as he had been the last couple of years, especially in comparison to last year, which I have said, you know, is easily the best year of his career. I thought he really dominated in a 1v1 kind of individual way last year that he just never has in his career. He's never been given that kind of responsibility as what he was given on Gen.G in 2023, but we're starting to get that version of Doran back. He's not getting the resources, but he is doing a lot more with the resources that he does have, and he's winning 1v1 a lot more. Just generally, I think he's playing better. I think he's been a big asset to this team over the course of this split. You know, Peanut and Delight were also good. I think this team's just very well-rounded. I would be scared of this team if I had to face them, and KDF is just not on that level quite yet. They are a good team. They're, you know, a top 6 team for sure, but I don't really expect this team to be able to compete with anybody who is, like, trying to go to Worlds. I don't think this is a Worlds caliber roster. I think they have quite a few clear flaws that I just think are going to be a bit difficult to overcome. Dud of the series for me, unfortunately, is going to go to Dudu in the top lane. I think we're really starting to figure out who he is individually as a player. This is somebody who has been a channel darling in the past and somebody who I've vouched for, you know, being on an upper tier team in the LCK, saying that he really deserves to be better than the situation that he's been given over the course of his, you know, career, playing for a really bad Hanwha Life team or a really bad, you know, KDF team last year. He finally does get a good team here, and he's really good against the players that he's better than, but when he goes up against Doran, or when he goes up against Zeus, or when he goes up against Keem, it's just a lot worse, right? He's not quite on the level of the best top laners in the region, but, you know, I don't think that that's something I'm going to freak out too much over. I just want to see a bit more consistency from him in matchups that are difficult against the best teams in the world. I think Leaper and Ondel have really returned to earth. This is kind of the KDF cycle, if you will, of this team just finding a bot lane that looks really good for a couple of weeks and then just like collapsing back down to earth after everything starts to normalize a bit. Teams start to get used to playing against them, and all of a sudden they just start playing like an average to below average bot lane again. This is what happened with Bull last split. This is happening right now with Leaper, who's just been essentially nothing over the past 2 to 3 weeks. Like, ever since weeks 1 and 2, he's really not been, you know, any sort of game-breaking type of bot laner. In fact, he's been a bit of a liability, especially in these big games, and Ondel certainly isn't doing much better. I think Cuz is still really freaking good in the jungle, and in fact, I think he's almost been underrated by me over the course of this split. He has still been an upper tier jungler, top 4, top 5 jungler in the region, but, you know, there's just not enough pressure to go around. The lanes are losing, and if the top and the bot and, you know, at times mid lane are all losing in terms of pressure and aren't winning 1v1, there's really not a lot you can do as a jungler in this meta because it's the scaling meta. So generally for KDF, I think they're running into that issue where they just don't really have the talent to beat the best teams in the LCK, but HLE is one of the best teams in the LCK. Hopefully they can continue this hot streak that they've been on, because they've really started re-cementing themselves as one of the best teams in the world. Then moving on now to day number 2, and man, I'm excited to talk about the kickoff series of day 2 because it's a pretty big upset, as we saw T1 taking on FearX, and FearX is going to pick up the 2-1 series win. This is massive for Fox. This is genuinely a gigantic win, even without the context of everything going on with T1 right now. This team has looked very inconsistent over the last couple of weeks. Essentially, ever since coming back from the Esports World Cup, they have struggled to readjust to the LCK split. I'm going to talk about why, even after this loss, I'm really not all that scared for T1, why I do think this is something that impacts my opinion of them. I'm not going to try and downplay the fact that there are some real concerns, the fact that they are 5-4, close to 500 really at all, and clearly the least consistent of the top 4 right now is certainly not something that is lost on me, but you know, T1 had a lot of weird things to deal with over the course of the last few weeks, and I think generally speaking, this is not a team that I would count out when moments are most important, and we'll talk about that again a bit later. But let's talk about FearX first and foremost, the things they did right, and the reason that they are sitting here as winners. I think the most interesting and most important thing to take away from this is this was not T1 throwing games, this was not T1 throwing the series, this was FearX outplaying them in a macro sense and just beating them. This was not like T1 getting leads and just not being clinical enough. It was not taking it seriously. It was FearX out-rotating, outplaying T1 and just winning the series in both of the games that they ended up taking. It was a really impressive performance, and in fact, quite a T1-esque performance from FearX in this one, and that's a really, really funny sign to be able to say. Player of the series for me is going to go to Clear in the top lane on the Gnar. He's had a couple of good games over the course of his career, but I've generally been unimpressed with Clear in terms of the performances that he's given as a whole. Since coming up as a pretty hyped prospect from the DRX system, he's just been kind of there in the top lane, one of the weaker top laners in the league, but this was kind of a defining performance for him. This is what you've wanted to see from Clear for a long time in terms of the consistency that he's able to offer as a carry. The Gnar in particular in game number 3 was genuinely terrific. Not only was he just better than Zeus in the laning phase, but he was way better than Zeus in terms of the team fighting, where he just was winning fights on his own. Now, I shouldn't say on his own, because the rest of this team was very good. Closer was very good in this series on the Corki, specifically in that first game, but Henna and Duro looking a lot better here on the Senna and the Ornn down in the bot lane. Obviously, that's something that has been kind of a T1 special over the course of this year. They've wanted to go for Senna combos. Generally speaking, a lot of the top teams in the world have been pretty reliant on Senna combos, which is a pretty interesting thing to try to analyze. But Henna and Duro looking very good here, Duro in particular, but Henna also looking very solid on the Senna. I think doing a really good job to just kind of stabilize and be a functional, like, support almost in team fights, and just generally be somebody that can enable the Gnar or the Corki or the Ornn to be unkillable as we get further along into the game. Raptor controlled, I think, a lot of the pathing and the pacing's the word I'm looking for in this game relatively well, and you know, this was kind of an anti-Raptor performance because he's typically somebody that either just wins or loses the game on the spot. He was just kind of a good supporting piece here. Just everybody on Fox playing really well, and I think that that's an encouraging sign. Hopefully this is something that can be replicable for them because it is a bit out of character. They aren't a very clean team typically, but the roster change bringing Duro in, I think, was something that I expected to stabilize this team a bit. Execute is just much more aggressive in terms of what he looks for in terms of engages, and Duro is somebody that I think will fit the style of this team a tad bit better, and we definitely saw that here, a much more calm and controlled style that ended up really just beating T1. And for T1, like I said, it's bad. Like, this is not a good loss. I'm not going to try to downplay the fact that there is no reason that they should be losing a series like this, because there isn't. Gumayushi's going to get done of the series. He just can't really play Ezreal at the same level that he can play some of the other champions, and that's a bit of a character flaw for him individually as a player. I've been comparing him a lot to Gala. I think that they're very similar players in terms of how they play, but Guma does have more bad games. That is definitely something I am willing to say, even if I do think individually they are pretty similar playstyle-wise. You know, Guma doesn't have those, or I guess Gala, I should say, doesn't have these like bad Ezreal games that Guma just randomly has. His positioning was really not good in a lot of these fights, and he really cost his team down the stretch, but it was far from just him. Faker's scoreline looks great because he completely popped off in game number 2, but games 1 and 3, that Tristana looked completely and utterly useless. And generally, if he hadn't been so good in game 2, he would have probably gotten done of the series. This was not good from Faker. Zeus got completely outplayed. The Ivern wasn't really all that relevant, and they picked Seraphine in game number 3, and that certainly wasn't something that was going to shut down the Senna. So, you know, there are concerns. The reason I'm not going to freak out about T1 and say that this team is not going to be, or they're going to have to like fight for a world spot or whatever, yada, 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 is not only that they've just returned from the Esports World Cup. I've said multiple times on this channel that the EWC was really detrimental to basically every team that went to it, that there's basically nobody coming out of that tournament being like, it was worth it. Like, there is really no reason to have traveled, you know, hours and hours across the world to go to a best of 3 tournament that honestly just doesn't really prove anything. Like, it's not like MSI where teams had a ton of time to practice and train. This is just a tournament dragged and dropped in the middle of a regular season that I'm sure teams weren't preparing for in the same kind of way as other international tournaments. And now you're back here and you have to immediately get back into the flow of the regular season with all these teams that have just been scrimming and, you know, haven't had to go go and do this big tournament, and you went far, you ended up winning the tournament. There are a lot of factors that I think have hurt T1's ability to come back into the regular season and perform in the same kind of way. That being said, T1 has always kind of been weird about summer regular season. I think this is a trend that people tend to forget about. Is go look at last year, especially. Like, Faker took that break in the summer split, and this team collapsed. Like, they were 500, at times below 500 in the regular season. Faker comes back, they figure it out, they end up finishing top 2. Like, it's just kind of what T1 does. They run into some issues in the summer split. They did this in 2021 as well, where they just run into some random issues, they figure it out in playoffs, and then they're fine. They go to Worlds and they're fine. It's kind of what I'm expecting from them. I don't think that this is a perfect team, but I certainly think that they are better than losing to Fox. And, you know, Fox is going to be happy that they were able to pick up a win here, capitalizing on a weaker T1 roster, but I don't think this confirms that Fox is somehow a playoff team or anything like that. I think they're in a better position now than they were in, you know, going into the week, clearly, but there still is a lot more that I need to see before I call them consistent by any stretch. And then moving on to our second series of day number 2, and again, another predictable outcome as we saw Nongshim RedForce taking on Gen.G. Gen.G going to pick up the 2-0 series win. They keep their undefeated hopes alive. They not only moved to 9-0, which of course is without a loss, but they moved to 18-0 in terms of their game score. They've yet to even drop a single game in the LCK split so far, at the very least, and obviously it would be pretty ridiculous if this team were to go undefeated. It would be entirely unprecedented, but they don't have to go undefeated to, you know, for us to be impressed with what is happening here. I mean, 18-0 at the very least is unbelievable. Like, the fact that they've gotten here in the first place is genuinely unfathomable. They are undefeated through the first round robin. They have completed a run-through of every single team in the LCK, and they have yet to drop a single game, regardless of what happens from this point onwards. This is an accomplishment that I hope people remember, because they really have been that dominant. It's not even all that surprising, and that's the biggest shock here, is that we kind of expected Gen.G to be this dominant after how they performed at MSI, after what they showed in the spring split. This is on pace to be the best League of Legends team of all time without really any sort of contenders, and that's a really fun thing to be able to say. But let's go ahead and talk about this series in particular. There's really not a lot of analysis that I can give because this team just kind of stomped Nongshim. There really wasn't a lot of gameplay to cover in this one, but Canyon continues to be unbelievable. He's going to get player of the series. The brand was basically doing all of the teamfight damage in the back half here because Chovy was just AFK, split pushing. Awesome. Like, sure, whatever. It doesn't even really matter. This team can win fights 4v5. They really are that good. And Canyon is able to carry a lot of these fights. Brand alone as a champion is able to carry a lot of these fights, and so you're not really worried about that. But he was still pretty good on the Maokai in game number 1 as well. We're seeing a rise in Maokai. We're seeing a rise in Sejuani, you know, kind of come back into meta, if you will. This has always been the trajectory every single year. It's the same story over and over again. Aggressive junglers end up being the kind of thing that dominates the early part of the season, and as we get further and further along, teams want to get a bit more consistent, so they start picking up Maokai and Sej a bit more, and then by the time we get to the World Championships, all of a sudden Maokai and Sej are the 2 most popular junglers in the game. It's funny how the cycle will always tend to repeat itself. I think that will happen again here in 2024 if I had to guess, but Canyon's pretty good at that style. He spent 2 years trying to get good at it, and so I imagine it will be just fine. Chovy was, of course, also the other player that I considered here for player of the series, mostly for that Tristana game in game number 1. The Azir was good, but a bit ineffective in game number 2. I shouldn't say ineffective. He was, like, solid. He did everything he was supposed to, but, you know, didn't really have to be the primary carry for this team just because of the way that they wanted to play out the game. You live with that. Canyon and Chovy as a mid-jungle duo is maybe the best that we've ever seen. Pays and Lehens continue to look awesome. Lehens as an engager is still one of the best in the entire world. He sees flank angles and general timings better than basically any other support in the world. Pays is pretty darn close to being one of the more interesting AD carries in the world. He has really kind of come into his own once again here in the summer split, as opposed to spring, where he was a little bit more questionable for this team. I think this meta fits him better, where he doesn't really need a ton of resources early on. I talk about this a lot in my LPL videos, but the meta right now for bot lane is find the AD carry that you like that needs as little resources as possible, and just try to be self-sufficient. Whether that's Ezreal, whether it's Ashe, whether it's Jhin, whether it's Misfortune, like these are the champions that I think are, you know, Senna's kind of in that zone as well. These are the champions that have been able to dominate this meta, that have been the most valuable in this meta, and Pays is very good on that style. Keen continues to look awesome on the top side. There's really just not a lot of negatives to give Gen.G. They're basically perfect, and Nongshim is just not on the level. Like, what else do you want me to say? First of all, substitution in the mid lane, Calyx is in for Fisher. It's fine. Like, Calyx is awesome at the Challengers League level. He has been truly exceptional, but this is not the first time that we've said that about a Nongshim mid laner. I think people are going to forget that we said the same exact thing about Fiesta when he first came up. We said the same exact thing about Call Me when he came up. These were guys that were in the MVP conversation down in the Challengers League that came into a bad Nongshim team and just could not hang at the LCK level. You know, Calyx looks about as good as they did in the Challengers League, and maybe even a tad bit better. Maybe he can come in and completely change this team's fortunes, but there's not been a very good history of good prospects in the mid lane coming through the Nongshim system and actually succeeding at the LCK level, so it's going to be something to continue to monitor. But, you know, Calyx is definitely at least more interesting than Fisher, even if he wasn't particularly good in this series. But the problem was definitely the top side of the map. Sylvie is the easiest possible choice for dud of the series that you could give. This guy was miserable in game 2, in game 1, it didn't matter. You know, canyoned him. He just went out there and dominated it. The matchup was not close. Mihail was also not very good on the top side, but he had to play into Keen, and so I can kind of give him a little bit of a pass there. Jiwoo and Guger were generally ineffective, but at the very least they were attempting to do things, and honestly, they were the best part of this team in this series, even if they still lost incredibly hard in the 2v2. Just wasn't a good series for Nongshim, but you never really expected it to be. You thought they were going to get blown out here, and that's exactly what happened. Nongshim is not the kind of team that can take on Gen.G, and Gen.G, to their credit, is now undefeated through the first round robin. Like I said, that is the big accomplishment. That is the takeaway from this series for me, is that this has to be one of the things that is celebrated about this team. They're probably not going to finish this split undefeated. I mean, come on, like, that is a ridiculous thing to ask of any team, but the fact that they have gotten through 9 series, every single team in the LCK, and we're still even asking the question, that should go to show you just how dominant they have been. And then moving on now to our middle day, day number 3 here in week number 5, and we kick off day 3 with a matchup between KT Rolster and DRX. The KT is going to pick up yet another win, and they're going to go 2-0 in this one. They get themselves not only above 500 in terms of series score, but above 500 in terms of game score for the first time in the summer split. Obviously, this is an expected win for them. They have gotten a much easier schedule in the second half of the first round robin, but still at the same time, they have fixed a lot of the mistakes that they were making at the beginning of the split. There are some reasons to be positive about this team overall. Honestly, I really haven't changed my opinion on this team all that much in the last couple of weeks. I do still think that there are clear issues to KT Rolster, and the fact that they run off of Pioshik and BDD and Beryl and these players that are hyper inconsistent in and of itself is always going to be a bit of a concern to me, but the KTRX boys ended up coming out and beating their former org, which is always a good sign. Player of the series is very obviously going to go to Deft. If there is one player on this team that I basically have no qualms or reservations about at all, it is Deft down in the bot lane, who is just a star. Like, there's nothing else left to say. Deft, for a little bit, was honestly somebody that I was like, you know, in 2021, 2022, I was saying he's a bit more of a name than he is like a player. Right now, he is really solid, but he wasn't a top 5 AD carry in the world for me. He wasn't in that conversation in 2021, 2022. Even when he won Worlds, like, he was the weak side bot laner for that team. He took a lot out of his repertoire in order to fit that team better with really aggressive players like Zeka and Pioshik elsewhere. He kind of felt like he was the one that sacrificed the most, which generally led to me believing, oh, okay, they're kind of phasing Deft out from being a primary carry. But really, it turns out that was just the structure of the team at the time, because he goes to DK last split and he's phenomenal, is a great 2v2 laner, is able to dominate and get leads very consistently, and he continues that here on KT Rolster. He is the best player on this team by a very considerable margin, and he continues to just straight up win games. Teddy and Plata were pretty good on the other side. Teddy in particular was very good in that second game on Kai'Sa, and it didn't really matter. Deft was better in both games, and that's a mark of a really good AD carry, is that even when the enemy is doing everything that they're supposed to be doing, you are still coming out on top. That is massive for him overall. BDD is another player that I want to shout out. I have been very negative about his 2024. I think, honestly, going and watching his 1v1s, it's just about as bad as I've been saying it's been on this channel. He has not been good in lane. He's not been good out of lane. In 2024, it's just not been a particularly good year so far for BDD in terms of what you see on tape, and it's really nice to see him have a series against Yehu, who's at least an okay caliber mid laner at this level, and just kind of dominate him 1v1. Obviously, the Tristana is what people will point to. Great game 2, but the Azir in game 1 was also pretty excellent from him. Really, really good takeaways there. You know, Pioshik and Beryl were solid, and I think even more encouragingly, Pioshik won a series on Sejuani and Maokai, which doesn't feel like it's possible. It doesn't really feel like what Pioshik does at a high level level, so it's nice to see that even with Deft and BDD being the primary carries, this team can still actively win games. Very much felt like it was either Pioshik wins or Pioshik loses this team games, and to see him take a secondary role I think is really positive. Perfect is somebody that I like a lot and was definitely the better top laner here. Overall, it's a nice win for KT, and it really solidifies them, but again, I'm not worried about their matchup against DRX. I'm worried about their matchup against the other teams that are around them that are going to be pushing for one of those world spots. Teams like DK, teams like HLE, teams like KDF, even T1, right? Those are the matchups that I'm more interested in. But for DRX, they've just completely fallen off the wagon. At this point, there's really nothing else left to say. They've gone from being a team that I think could compete for, like, being the best non-playoff team. Not that I ever thought they could compete for playoffs. Bottom 4 feels pretty locked in, but they might be a bottom 2 team in the league, like, in terms of how they are playing in the recent weeks. Teddy is still playing pretty fine. I think Playta is still playing fine, generally speaking, even if this was one of his weaker series in a while, but top side of the map is just a complete disaster, and if Yehu is not surviving, then this team has no chance of winning. He's going to get dud of the series for me in the mid lane. He's honestly been significantly worse in the summer split than he's been in his small stints in spring. Last year, there have been small little bits and pieces that I think have been positive for him overall as a player, but summer has really not been that great of a split for him. A lot of that is the fact that DRX is really struggling, but part of that is just that he individually has been playing worse. Sponge is one of the worst junglers in the league. He is clearly near the bottom of that ranking, even if he wasn't the biggest problem in this series. Rascal is just awful on the top side of the map, genuinely one of the worst players in the LCK, full stop. I understand that technically he was better in this series, like he was, at least doing things in this series, but that is the outlier. Like, he has truly been awful. I can't stress that enough. DRX is just not a team that I believe in anymore, regardless of their early season success. The fact that they looked like they might be the best of the rest at the beginning of the split, that is not something that they could carry over. They have clearly fallen back into place, and this team is truly horrible right now, but it's a nice win for KT. They get themselves above 500 before the break at the halfway point, and that's a really nice place to be. Again, all you really need to do is get yourself into playoffs, get yourself some confidence before going into that, like, season, finals, the Worlds qualifiers, things like that. That's where you really need to play your best league, and this is all just kind of a tune-up for that. But then moving on to our second series of day number 3, and this one is much, much more interesting to talk about. It's the Kwangdong Freecs taking on OK BRION, and they did it. The bros did it. They get their first win of the split here. They win the series 2-1 over KDF, a likely playoff team here in the LCK, and I can certainly say I didn't predict this outcome, even with the roster change that Bro made going into this series. You can see they made 2 on the screen. One of those was forced. The other one was a decision that they ended up making, but we'll talk about that. I guess we could talk about that now. First of all, Void is back into the jungle. Remember, this is something that I actually got corrected on earlier in the year when these two teams played off against each other in the first part of the round robin, where Void is going to have to play against KDF as the reserve jungler because they are loaning in Gen.G, their starting jungler, from KDF. He can't actually play against his parent team. That's part of the loan agreement, and so Void was in here. But the other change, the one that I think will last a little bit longer, is Fate coming into the mid lane here. Fate is a name that I'm sure LCK fans are familiar with. He was a long-time mid laner for multiple teams, DRX and Freecs and many other different rosters back in the day. Sandbox, he's played for multiple different teams, but he's back into the LCK here. He had a really rough year last year on DRX. There were just a lot of things going wrong for that DRX team, of course, which was a historic disaster last year. But Fate, I think, individually is definitely an upgrade to this room. Karis, Pulbay, we've talked about it. They're not exactly starting caliber LCK mid laners at this point in their career. They have some problems, and they just have not developed in the way that you would like. And so bringing someone like Fate in who can be kind of, I guess, a bit of a stabilizer in that room is probably a good thing overall, not to mention the fact that he is just better than a lot of the other players they would typically be able to get with their current profile. I think he just wanted to get back into the LCK, which of course I can respect. Playing on any team is probably better than playing on no team at all, but he looked awesome in this first series. He immediately looks like a massive upgrade for them. He's going to get player of the series as a whole. I think you can point to a couple of performances that really stood out. Obviously, the Corki in game number 1 was the most defining because he really did just completely take over the game. KDF was clearly not prepared to end up facing someone as good as Fate, and quite frankly, Bulldog was not as good as Fate in this matchup, which is a really interesting kind of wrinkle into this little equation. But he was also really good on the Yone in game number 3 as well. Pretty versatile player. He was known back in the day for being more of that shove and roam kind of facilitative mid laner, not somebody who needs a lot of resources, but somebody who would be great as a secondary carry on teams. He's probably going to be given a bit of a bigger role on this roster, if only because the rest of this roster is not as good as him, and so he should probably probably be the primary carry in a lot of these games. We'll see if he can step up to that. I think the meta is a lot more in favor of mid laners being a little bit more resource heavy right now, so we'll see if he's, in meta in terms of how he ends up playing out the rest of this split, but very good first showing. I also think Void was pretty good considering he was filling in. Still think Youngjae is the right option to play more of, but in the case that they couldn't play him like they can't in a series against KDF, Void I think did a relatively decent job of filling in for that. Envy and Polu probably had their single best series as a duo so far. Polu in particular was awesome in that third and final game. A couple of really phenomenal engages on the rel that really separated him from Ondo and what he was able to do on the other side of the map. Polu has been somebody that I've criticized pretty heavily for just not being on the same page as the rest of the team and for coming up with angles that it doesn't feel like he's communicating properly, but this was a much better performance. Envy was definitely in a position to capitalize a lot more on the engages than, we've typically seen out of this bot lane duo at the beginning part of the year. Morgan was fine, solid on the top side, definitely the better top laner here. Overall, Bro was pretty good, and I think generally speaking for a first win, more than halfway through the year, this is a pretty good look. This is not the hopeless kind of feeling that I think you would expect from Bro, but for KDF on the other side, they have their own problems right now. This feels like a pretty traditional KDF kind of run of the split where they look really good at the start, where a couple of roster changes end up feeling like they're going to make a difference, and then by the time you hit the end of the regular season, they've kind of collapsed back down to earth. This is exactly what happened in the spring split. This is kind of what happened last year as well, where they got worse over the course of this year. There is certainly like a concern in that trend. That's certainly not the ideal way that you want to run your organization, but hopefully this isn't enough of a collapse to get them out of the playoffs. I think they're probably out of being a team that I would expect to compete for a world spot, but with, championship points, they'll probably get into the qualifiers and things like that. So hopefully they can just maintain, but it's not a good look right now. Dudu's going to get dud of the series. He has really fallen off. It's really funny because he was the one player last year when this team was really struggling that didn't fall off. He was trying his hardest to 1v9 most of the games that this team was in, but he had a really bad week here in week number 5, and that's going to be something to continue to monitor. If he's going to be bad on the top side of the map, they do not have the firepower to make up for that, because bot lane has really collapsed back down to earth, and even if Cousin, Bulldog are interesting, Cousin in particular, still having a pretty good split. If topside is also losing, if you have two lanes that are just not going to be able to hold up, like this team could definitely fall a lot further than 500, which they are at right now, but Cousin, Bulldog still are playing well. I think Cuz is a very interesting player individually, and I'm really not worried about him. Bulldog is somebody that is going to be, rather hit or miss, but for the most part, I think is still a positive, even if he did lose this series to Fate. Overall, there are things to take away that I think are fine for KDF, but the worries are also there. Top and bot lane are not good at the current moment, and they have to be in order for this team to reach the expectations and the goals that they want. So you got to see them get on track soon, because losing to Bro is about as disastrous as it gets, but massive win for Bro. Getting that first win out of their way and, just trying to get back on track is really nice, and I think Fate is going to be a really big upgrade here in the mid lane. Excited to see what happens for the rest of the split for them. And then moving on now to day number 4, and yet another very exciting series to talk about, as we saw T1 taking on Hanwha Life Esports, and HLE picks up yet another win over T1. This just feels like they kind of have their number. T1 has really not been able to beat HLE a lot over the course of this year. I think that they've only beaten them in one best of 3 and then in one best of 5, and obviously they lost another best of 5 to them in the playoffs last split, and they've lost both times in the regular season so far this split in the best of 3 stage. It's not looking good for T1 right now. There are some real problems, and while I do still sit here and say that, regular season is not a great place to judge T1 on whether or not they're going to be able to, perform in the playoffs. Just historically speaking, they've almost always performed better in playoffs and then even better in the international stage than they have in the regular season. There are some real concerns with this team, and I think more pressingly, there are some real positives to the other teams that are competing for one of those top 2 spots. So really excited to talk about that here. Player of the series is going to go to Doran in the top lane. If anybody has Zeus's number, it's Doran. That has become abundantly clear. Obviously, there are a lot of people that have been able to beat Zeus relatively consistently over the past year or so because he's just inconsistent as a player, but Doran is definitely, probably the most famous one in terms of what he's been able to do, because every single time these two play off against each other, like Doran clearly just has the MO on how to beat Zeus, what his tendencies are, what to do against him in lane, because he just dominates the matchup every single time. It's really, really crazy to watch. I'm not going to try and brag too much on this channel, but one thing that I do want to bring up for, longtime fans of the channel is that if you go back and watch my off-season grades video that I did in, December of this past year, the comments on that video were mostly negative. I got a lot of backlash in that video for ranking Chovy too high. Like, I gave him an A+ grade, and people thought that that was ridiculous. And people were really mad about me giving Zeus an A- and not an A+ or an A or something like that, because he's clearly the best top laner in the world, everybody told me. And I didn't see it. Like, watching the tape the past couple of years, he's just too inconsistent for me to say that. And honestly, the takes in that video, considering that it's one of my most disliked videos, if not my most disliked video of all time, the takes in that video have aged incredibly well, and it's pretty funny to just kind of see how that ends up working out. Zeus just does not have the consistency. He's been really bad in the last couple of weeks. Hopefully he can figure something out. But Doran, you know, this is mostly to prop up Doran, who has been phenomenal throughout the summer split so far. Has been really good in and out of lane. It's just been a really big asset for Hanwha Life and has had a great split. It's not just him, though. I think Peanut also has looked amazing. Again, he is very sneakily like an MVP frontrunner for me. He's probably going to finish in the top 3 in terms of my MVP voting, so long as he keeps up this pace. I'm certainly not going to predict that he's going to win just with how dominant Gen.G has been, but, you know, Peanut's been pretty darn good, and I think he's honestly under-recognized in terms of how good he has been for this team. Zeka goes deathless. That's always a good sign. Viper was amazing. Delight was really good. HLE is just finding the best form that they found in a long time right now, and I would argue that they're in the best form they've been in all year at the current moment. This is the best they've looked, and they were already really close to being a top 2 team this past split. I mean, if anybody's a favorite right now to get that number 2 seed, it might even be HLE. But for T1, on the other side, this team is really going through their own struggles. I already talked a bit about Zeus, who is dud of the series, just got completely outplayed by Doran. This guy is mega inconsistent, and again, I'm really happy to see that my analysis on that has aged well. I think a lot of my analysis on the LCK has aged well, but that is definitely one that, you know, stands out in my brain as something that I'm really glad I took a stance on that. Guma and KT continue to really struggle. Guma's positioning this week was really poor, which is something, honestly, he's always been really good at. He's always been pretty good at not making major mistakes and just keeping his team in games. That was not the case here. KT had a really bad series. No real good engages coming in from him. Faker was awful in that second game. Just felt like he was completely disconnected from the rest of his team. Owner was definitely the only player that wasn't making egregious errors, but my biggest problem with Owner has always been the fact that he's not going out there and actively winning games for the team. If you follow this channel, you know that my analysis on Owner is he really capitalizes on winning lanes more than any other top jungler. He doesn't create those winning lanes himself, and so it's just a really weird situation for T1. Again, they went through their own struggle last year around this time, mostly because Faker had to be taken out of the lineup, and that certainly isn't the case right now. But whatever they're going through, you have to hope they can fix it in the same way that they were able to last year, because it really looks bad. They're 500. Like, this is not just like, they're the same record as, you know, a lot of mediocre teams in the league, as teams like the Kwangdong Freecs, and that's really not where T1 should be. They should clearly be in the top 2, and they're just not. So, yes, there are real concerns for T1, but you have to imagine they're going to figure something out. But HLE is legit. Like, it's time to start believing in this team as one of the best in the entire world. They've proven that they deserve that at this point. And then keeping the train rolling here with our second series of day number 4, it's another very interesting clash between Gen.G and Dplus KIA that Gen.G is going to be able to take in 3. Unfortunately, the undefeated split comes to an end here. They lose their first game, but they do not lose their first series. They stay undefeated, at least in terms of series score, moving to 10-0. They looked amazing here in the back half. I mean, even with that game 1 loss, like, they kind of got destroyed in that first game, and there were some moments in game 2 where it was looking a bit questionable. With even that being said, Gen.G still looked amazing coming out of this series because they were not playing perfect. They had a lot of mistakes, and yet they were still able to capitalize on the advantages they needed to capitalize on the moment that DK gave them the slightest bit of pressure back. All of a sudden, it just became Gen.G all the time, and that's the mark of one of the best teams of all time. Like, truly, you can't make a single mistake against this Gen.G team or they are going to punish you for it, and that's exactly what happened. Credit to DK. They did their absolute best to try and make things interesting. Unfortunately, they couldn't quite come away with the win. Player of the series for me is going to go to Chovy. What the hell happened in game number 3? I'm not even, like, negatively talking about anybody on DK, specifically Showmaker, who was pretty good in this series, but Chovy was up 100 CS. He Flame Horizon Showmaker at 10 minutes into the game. What are we doing? Like, how do you even allow this to happen? What is the process behind this? Chovy is just on such a different level in terms of how he is able to lane. There is no one that is comparable ever in the history of this esport. There is nobody that has ever been what Chovy is right now, which is somebody that if you give an inch, he's not going to take a mile. He's going to take the whole freaking freaking road. Like, there is nothing else left to say about Chovy. He is dominant, and maybe you want to see him have a bit more pressure in the mid game, but his late game team fighting is better than anybody else in the world. His mid game pressure is like just top 10 in the world, and his early game laning is top 1 in the world, and he is in a tier of his own in that own category. So I just don't know what else to say. Chovy really is the best player in the world, and it's not even particularly close at the moment. There is nobody that's even remotely contesting him, in my opinion. He is that dominant. But he wasn't the only player to play well in this series. Keen dominated game number 3 on the Renekton. He has really solidified himself as the best top laner in the LCK without really a challenger, as well as Doran is playing right now. I just don't think he's on the same level as Keen in terms of, what he does on a game-to-game basis. Nobody takes over the late game, and it's just able to dominate team fights in that way. Pays and Lahans were really good. Pays in particular, I thought was really good at the end of game number 1 on the Ashe. I thought he did a really good job setting up for the rest of his team, and even with Canyon having a down series, which by the way has become super common against DK, I'm not sure if it's just old team jitters or if, again, as I've said, Lucid just kind of knowing him, because there are some weird plays coming out from Lucid that I don't think he would make if he didn't know Canyon's tendencies super well. But Canyon has always struggled against DK in these series. He did last split as well, and even with that being the case, like, this team has more than enough firepower to get over the hump. I really, really believe that Gen.G is on pace to be the best team of all time, and they just have to keep it going. And for DK, I'm certainly not going to criticize them for this loss. I mean, they dominated Gen.G in game number 1, and I'm calling Gen.G potentially the best team of all time. That is such an endorsement of how good DK is right now. They just unfortunately couldn't close out this series. They played phenomenally against the best team in the world, and they just couldn't really close it, which is unfortunate. I do have to give dud of the series to someone, and so it's going to go to Kellen down in the support position. I don't even think Kellen played all that bad. It's mostly for the Renata in game number 3. I think he was pretty good in games 1 and 2 on the Rakan and on the Karma. Just somebody had to get it, and he was the player that I think was taken advantage of the most in that third and final game, but everybody else on this team was good. If Showmaker was a little bit better in lane, maybe they have more of a chance in that third and final game. If Lucid was a little bit more aggressive and trying to get resets on the Viego, perhaps they have something in game number 3. Kingen was awesome this series. I think aiming was really good in this series. There are still so many positive takeaways for DK here that it's really hard to be anything other than positive. It's just unfortunate that you couldn't walk out with the win, because that's really what we were all looking for, was the potential upset. But they did their absolute best, and this might very well be a top 3 to 5 team in the world at the current moment with how they're playing. I think with their roster construction, that is a gross overperformance, and that's pretty awesome to see, the fact that they're getting the most out of these players. But this has done nothing but strengthen my resolve in DK being a top team. And for Gen.G, obviously, they are the team in the world right now. Esports World Cup notwithstanding, they have really not faltered at any point so far in 2024, and even that continued here, even with some speed bumps, some roadblocks in the way this team remained undefeated in terms of series score. And can anything stop them at this point? I mean, that's really got to be the question. And that's going to bring us to our 5th and final day of action here in the LCK in week number 5. And we have yet another really interesting outcome, as we saw FearX taking on KT Rolster. And FearX is going to pick up yet another massive victory here. They just won the telecom war in 1 week. They beat T1, they beat KT Rolster, and here they are sitting at 4 and 6, and all of a sudden this conversation for the number 6 seed in the playoffs has become a lot more interesting, because nobody really has it locked up. KDF looking very questionable this week, Fox looking really good, KT even dropping a series here. Like, there's room, we'll just say, for teams to kind of swoop in, and I think the top 7 is now starting to become a lot more of a conversation than maybe it has been at any point this split, where it's always kind of felt like a top 6. And so this is a really interesting outcome for Fox. I think they look infinitely better with Duro in there as opposed to Execute. It clearly feels like this team is like wrapped up their really aggressive style and just gone a lot more focused on the macro and a lot more calm and controlled, and I think that's helped them in a lot of different ways. I think it's gotten the most out of a lot of specific players, none more so than maybe Henna down in the bot lane, who's going to get player of the series. Maybe I've been underrating Henna for a long time. Maybe this guy actually is pretty solid, pretty decent at this level, because he just outplayed Deft in a best of 3, which is a pretty crazy thing to say. Deft, kind of known for being a bit more consistent, has definitely dropped a bit of that since coming to KT. He had a couple of really bad games last split as well, and he had a couple of bad games on DK as well, but Henna being able to outplay him in a best of 3, in 2 games back to back, that's really huge for Fox, and that's really huge for Henna individually as a player. It was really nice to see him get a lot of resources from the rest of this team and be able to capitalize, specifically in game number 2. Was still very good in game 3, especially in the back half, being able to take over fights. Just didn't have to do nearly as much in game 3. Was the guy in game number 2, especially front to back. Want to give a big shout out to Raptor, who had a really good series, completely outplayed Pioshik in basically every front, was awesome on the Vi, the engages were perfectly timed, and this is the kind of champion that I think really enables Raptor to do his own thing, because he can play aggressive in the early game and not really feel the necessity to have to carry in the back half. I think that was a big concern of Raptor. That was a big concern of Willers when he was on this team, is that, I have to carry games. I have to be the one to either win or lose my team the game. I have to play aggressive. I think something like Vi can be a lot better to be able to set up for the Zeri and the Ahri and the Kennen if you really want to do that in the final game here. Raptor was really good. Closer is another player who, quite frankly, has just been good across this split. He has been an above average mid laner, and I think that is shocking for me. It didn't really feel like he was going to take that next leap ever, but I would argue that this has maybe been one of his better splits as a pro. This is about as good as the year he got all pro, because, all pro voting is very weird in the LCK. This is probably about as good in terms of performances on a game-to-game basis as what he gave there, and that's impressive. Duro has upgraded this team a lot. Clear was really good in this series. Overall, Fox just looked really solid. Henna in particular has really emerged as somebody that can very much win games for this team over the course of this split, and that's going to be something to monitor. But, Fox made a statement this week. They are here to stay, and for KT, I think they're definitely going to feel frustrated that they couldn't keep their win streak going. They obviously the second longest win streak in the LCK, only behind Gen.G, who is undefeated, but I think they went into this feeling like this was going to be a rather free win, and they just couldn't walk away with that. They felt pretty off their game today. Deft is going to get done of the series. This felt really obvious to me. He was not good on the Neela. He was really not great in game 3 on the Ezreal either. Maybe he wasn't the biggest problem, but was certainly in the conversation for being the biggest problem in these final games. I think the reason that BDD is not getting it, because I think BDD was worse in game 3, definitely played the worst in that final game of the series, is that BDD was awesome in game 1, and really he was the driving force for their game 1 win in the first place. It's really hard for me to give dud of the series to somebody that I think actively won a game for the team in the series, even if they were on the losing side, even if they were really bad the rest of the series. It's just really hard for me to justify that, and so if Deft was about as equally bad as BDD, which he was in this series, then yeah, Deft is going to be able to get that. Beryl was also not particularly good either. A lot of poorly timed engages, and I think specifically on the Alistar in game number 2, just it didn't feel like they felt comfortable on the Neela-Alistar duo. It really felt like they were not practiced on that. Perfect was not nearly as good on the top side as Clear. That's really not a matchup you should be losing. You need to be the better top laner if you're Perfect there. And then Pioshik was essentially ineffective on the Sejuani. I do like him playing Sej and showing that he can be effective on that champion, but unfortunately that wasn't the case in this series. Got completely out-jungled by Raptor in the back half here. So KT definitely still has their own problems. This is not a fixed team. This is not a finished product. I still think that they are on the up as opposed to what they were at the beginning of the year, but this is not an ideal loss. This certainly does put a damper on what was a pretty good win streak for them. And for Fox, it's the complete opposite. This is best case scenario. They are starting to play in a way that is almost the opposite of what they have been for a majority of this year. People are attributing it to the coaching staff, to Ryu. Ryu was here for the bad as well. So just pretending like he is a perfect coach that, results-based thinking would tell you is the one changing things. It's just not something that I can look at in that way. People know my thoughts on coaches on this channel, where it's basically impossible to tell what kind of role they have outside of draft. I'm not going to sit here and say that the coaches completely turn things around, but it is nice to see that at least the atmosphere surrounding the team has not completely collapsed, and that they are still very much open to trying to grab one of those spots if something opens up. But that's going to bring us to our final series of the week here. It's a battle of 2 and 7 teams, as we saw Nongshim RedForce taking on DRX. And Nongshim is going to pick up the 2-0 series win. This cements DRX as probably the second worst team in the league right now, with Bro getting a miraculous win and obviously, looking at least interesting. DRX probably had the worst week of any team in the LCK, which is really not an ideal place for you to be a little over halfway into the season, having your worst split. Really not looking good, just generally not having a lot of upside. There's a lot to not like about DRX right now. I'll definitely get into that. But for Nongshim, this is a pretty cool win. I don't think it really solidifies anything for them. I think this team is still pretty bad, but at the very least, you're able to take down the other bad teams, which is a pretty good sign. Player of the series for me is honestly pretty obviously going to go to Guger in the support position. Man, did I not expect to say that over the course of this split. I was really not anticipating Guger being somebody that I looked at as like a big asset to his team, but here we are, like a beautiful Nautilus performance in game number 1, one of the best support games that I've seen all across the entire week here in the LCK, and then a pretty solid Ornn game in game number 2 as well. I think he's mostly getting this player of the series for the Nautilus in game number 1. The Ornn was definitely a little flashier, but maybe not quite as substantial, at least across the entirety of the game, but just a great series from Guger, completely outplayed basically everybody on the other side of the map, and hopefully they're going to be able to get something out of him, because the expectation was that he was going to be by far the worst player in the LCK, and so if you're getting literally any kind of positive out of him, that is a major asset for Nongshim considering the expectations. But Jiwoo continues to look really good at being able to capitalize on plays that are set up for him. He hasn't been quite as dominant, I would say, over the past couple weeks as he was at the beginning of the split and in spring, but he's still been pretty good. Fisher was the one that you really have to look for in a positive way in this series. He was back in, Calyx was back down. I wonder if they just wanted Calyx to get bodied by Chovy and just didn't want Fisher's confidence to go even lower than it already was. I don't know the decision behind that, but Fisher looked awesome in this series. Completely abused Yehu in the back half here on the Corki. Truly was one of the best series that we've seen Fisher play. He's had a couple of good series over the course of this split. In a lot of their wins, he's actually looked pretty okay, just not really consistent at all. His bad is really bad, and so something to keep watching out for. Sylvie, Mihail looking good. Mihail in particular actually had a pretty good series, and so Nongshim just looking like the better team. That's a good sign. And the fact that Guger in particular, that Fisher, they were the players that really stepped up and really won this series for the team, that's really encouraging, because they are the players with the most question marks for sure on this roster. So nice to see that they're able to step up when they need to, but for DRX, it is panic mode. Like, you suck. There is nothing else left to say. It's really funny. Teddy might watch these videos because I've been complaining my entire channel's history about Teddy being the kind of guy to sit back and, try to play within structure, be really good in that system, be really good if he's, put in a solid position, but isn't going to be the guy that flips plays or 50-50s or tries to go out and win the game 1v9. Well, I think he's gotten real pissed off with this DRX team, and it's just completely, flipped that style. He's not even playing the Jin Air Teddy style anymore. He's just decided, like, screw it, I'm going for 50-50 plays. I'm gonna try to flip the game on weird engages and just see what I can do on the Zeri, because nobody else is trying to help me here. And, I like this. Like, honestly, this is what I would prefer out of Teddy, rather than just kind of waiting for his opportunities to approach on a bad team like DRX, but, outside of Teddy, there was no one trying to do anything here. Yehu was awful. He is going to get done of the series once again here. Was miserable in game number 2. I mean, truly awful. That scoreline does not indicate just how bad he was. He was just as bad as in game number 1 as well. Just a really bad series, and honestly, a really bad week for Yehu, somebody who at one point I was looking at it as at least an interesting mid lane prospect. Playta also didn't have a very good week. I'm a huge fan of Playta, but, I can't hype up bad performances, and that's kind of what he gave here. Sponge continues to just be kind of a disaster for this team. Rascal's scoreline looks good, but man, he had no impact on these games, and honestly, a couple of really big mechanical misplays from Rascal, even if this was one of his better weeks in a while, which is really saying something. Overall, DRX is just kind of a tragically bad team, not a lot to like about what they're doing right now. Teddy, I've been pushing back on the Teddy is elo held argument, because it feels like, if he were a player that was a little bit more aggressive, he could perhaps actually win a couple more games for this team. Well, now we're seeing that, that aggression sometimes is going to be a double-edged sword. So we'll see what happens with DRX, but at the very least, I think this is better for Teddy individually as a player, for my perception of him, but just didn't end up working out here. And then for Nongshim on the other side, this is a nice win. It doesn't really mean anything. This is not a playoff team. This is not a team that will be competing for a playoff spot, but at the very least, winning a series like this shows that you're not the worst of the worst, and that's really all that I think they're playing for right now. Alright, but that is going to do it for my LCK week number 5 overview and analysis video here in the summer split, up on the screen now. The updated standings after 5 weeks of action, of course, some pretty interesting things. You just gotta make top 6 in order to make playoffs, but it's not just about the standings, it's about the power rankings as well, which you can see in my power rank column. The number 1 to 10 there is going to indicate where I personally power rank these teams from number 1 to number 10. Of course, change next to that is going to be how that has changed from last week to this week, so we can go over the risers and the fallers, and we've been waiting for a big week of change in the LCK. There's been a lot of sprinkles of interesting things here and there, but I'm finally willing to kind of readjust my power rankings after being pretty hesitant to move teams up or down too much over the past couple of weeks. The top is going to change. Gen.G will, of course, stay the same. They're the number 1 team in the LCK, but moving to number 2, it's going to be Hanwha Life Esports. Right now, I do believe they are the second best team in the LCK, and I think that, my prediction would be that they would make make finals. I'm not feeling super confident on that because, again, it's just hard to count T1 out, but we'll get to them in a second. Poor DK gets jumped by HLE, even though they performed really well this week. Feels like a pretty bad kind of turn of events. DK has a real right to be that number 2 team at the moment, but I just have a higher, opinion of HLE's roster. I think from an upside perspective, I would expect the best version of HLE to beat the best version of DK, at least in the current state. And T1 gonna fall all the way down to number 4. Like, I can excuse a lot, and honestly, I still believe in this team to be a top 2 team, and to be somebody that competes to win worlds, but it's not looking good right now, and I have to do something about that in my power rankings, and so they're gonna move down to 4. 5 and 6 are also gonna switch spots. KT Rolster going to jump up to 5. Their winning streak was, of course, cut short at the end of the week with a pretty big upset, but still think this team is pretty good, and I definitely think they're better than KDF, who looked pretty awful this week. They're going to fall down to number 6. There are real concerns about this team, and honestly, if they don't continue to, keep their foot on the gas, FearX, who jumps up to number 7 here, is definitely going to be a contender, like to make that top 6 spot instead. It felt pretty locked in, the top 6 at the beginning of the split. FearX is certainly making that a lot more interesting after a very good week number 5, so we'll see there, but bottom 3 very much feel like bottom 3. Nongshim going to jump up to number 8 with that win over DRX, and they are going to fall down to number 9. I've been calling DRX potentially the best of the rest because of the beginning part of their split, but that is just not the case anymore. This team is not good enough to be able to maintain that, and they're going to fall into the bottom 2. Bro is going to stay at 10, even with the win, because it was kind of a shocking win, and I really don't expect Bro to be able to continue that. We'll see if that does end up proving to be incorrect. Maybe Bro goes on a little bit of a run and finishes in 9th or finishes in 8th. That would be pretty miraculous for them, but it definitely is possible considering the standings at the current moment. But those are my power rankings. Let me know what you agree with or disagree with down in the comments section below. Do you agree with the teams I'm moving up? Do you agree with the teams I'm moving down? Would love to know your thoughts and opinions down there, but it's time to get into my player of the week and my dud of the week here for week number 5. Player of the week was pretty easy. It's going to go to Chovy. I mean, this guy's just the best player in the world, and it's really obvious when you watch his games. When he's up 100 CS against Showmaker in 15 minutes or whatever it was, it's just unfair. Like, there's nobody that can go toe-to-toe with him in terms of his raw mechanics, and maybe sometimes you can criticize his lack of, team fight ability in terms of, like, mentality, split pushing a little bit too much and maybe playing a little bit too slow. That's not something that I think is that big of a problem for Gen.G or for Chovy in general. We've seen when he needs to, he can turn it on, but, Chovy's the best player in the world, and I think that's becoming clearer and clearer. My honorable mentions this week: Henna, the AD carry for FearX. He was awesome this week. FearX in general looked awesome this week. Again, they're kind of marching their way into the playoff conversation if they can keep up this kind of pace. If Henna can keep up this kind of pace, that's going to be really interesting, and he was by far the best player on that team this week. He's honestly been pretty good across this entire split, so pretty impressed with him. And then Doran is the other honorable mention here from Hanwha Life. He was awesome in both of their series. HLE has really proven to be one of the better teams in the LCK. In my opinion, one of the top 5 teams at minimum in the world, and I really do think this is the kind of team that could surprisingly win worlds if everything were to go right. I know a lot of people don't agree with me on that, but I think this is a potential worlds winning team, and Doran, playing the way that he is right now is a big part of the reason I have that confidence. People were looking at him as a potential weak link. He has been anything but for this team so far this split. So Henna and Doran are the runner-ups, but Chovy is my player of the week, and my dud of the week, unfortunately, is going to go to Yehu, the mid laner here for DRX. Just a miserable week for DRX and a miserable week for Yehu, who was really bad in both of their series. I considered someone from the Kwangdong Freecs in this role just because they also played really bad, but Yehu individually was by far the worst performing member in the LCK this week, and I don't even think it was really all that up for debate. A mid laner that I've said has some promise in the past. He just doesn't seem to be able to hold on to that as the split continues to go along. He's good in small, short bursts, but isn't exactly great once you start to get to the deeper parts of his game. He's been exposed a bit the longer he's been in the LCK, so he's going to get my dud of the week, and Chovy is going to get my player of the week, but that's going to do it. I do hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. Lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. We don't only post about the LCK on this channel. We post about all 4 of the major regions. That's the LCS, LEC, LCK, and the LPL every single week on this channel. So if you're interested in a comprehensive overview of everything going on in LoL esports, this is the place for it. Hit that subscribe button and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do go live. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all later.